Spanish exploration and conquest. Only in the areas that Spain explored and claimed did colonization begin immediately. On his second voyage in 1493, Christopher Columbus brought to Hispaniola 17 ships loaded with 1,200 men, along with seeds, plants, livestock, chickens, and dogs, as well as microbes, rats, and weeds. The settlement he named Isabella in the modern Dominican Republic and its successors became the staging area for the Spanish invasion of America, an often brutal and highly centralized conquest. On the islands of Cuba and Hispaniola, the Europeans and the animals they imported learned to adapt to the new environment. When the Spaniards moved on to explore the mainland, they rode island-bred horses and ate island-bred cattle and hogs. Cortez and other explorers. At first, Spanish explorers fanned out around the Caribbean basin. In 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon reached Florida, and Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama to the Pacific Ocean, followed by Panfilo de Narvaez and others who traced the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. In the 1530s and 1540s, conquistadors traveled farther, exploring many regions claimed by the Spanish monarchs. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado journeyed through the southwestern portion of what is now the United States at approximately the same time that Hernán de Soto explored the southeast. Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo sailed along the California coast. Francisco Pizarro, who ventured into western South America, acquired the richest silver mines in the world by conquering the Incas. But the most important conquistador was Hernán Cortés, a Spanish notary who first arrived in the Caribbean in 1506. In 1519, he led a force of roughly 600 men from Cuba to the Mexican mainland to search for rumored wealthy cities. Capture of Tenochtitlan. As he traveled on horseback toward the Aztec capital, Cortés, speaking through Doña Marina and other interpreters, recruited peoples whom the Aztecs had long subjugated. The Spaniards' huge domesticated beasts and noisy weapons awed their new allies. Yet the Spaniards, too, were awed. Years later, Bernal Diaz de Castillo recalled the first site of Tenochtitlan, built on islands in Lake Texcoco. Quote, "We were amazed and said that it was like the enchantments on account of the great towers and queues or temples and buildings rising from the water, and all built of masonry. Soldiers wondered whether the things that we saw were not a dream." The Spaniards came to Tenochtitlan not only with horses and guns, but also with smallpox, transmitting an epidemic that had begun on Hispaniola. The disease peaked in 1520, fatally weakening Tenochtitlan's defenders. Quote, "It spread over the people as great destruction. An Aztec later remembered there was great havoc. Very many died from it." Largely as a consequence, Tenochtitlan surrendered in 1521, and the Spaniards built Mexico City on its site. Cortés and his men seized a fabulous treasure of gold and silver. Thus, less than 3 decades after Columbus's first voyage, the Spanish monarchs, who treated the American territories as their personal possessions, controlled the richest, most expensive empire Europe had known since ancient Rome. Spanish colonization. Spain established the model of colonization that other countries later imitated, a model with 3 major elements. First, the crown tried to maintain tight control over the colonies, imposing a hierarchical government that allowed little autonomy to remote jurisdictions. That control included, for example, carefully vetting prospective immigrants and limiting their number. Settlers were then required to live in towns under the authorities' watchful eyes and to import all their manufactured goods from Spain. Roman Catholic priests dispatched to the new territories attempted to ensure the colonists' conformity with Orthodox religious views. Second, men comprised most of the first colonists. Although some Spanish women later immigrated to America, the men took primarily indigenous and later African, women as their wives or concubines, a development more often than not encouraged by colonial administrators. They thereby began creating the racially mixed population that characterizes much of Latin America to the present day. Third, the colony's wealth was based on the exploitation of both the native population and slaves imported from Africa. Spaniards took over the role once assumed by native leaders who had exacted labor and tribute from their subjects. Cortés established the encomienda system, which granted indigenous villages to individual conquistadors as a reward for their services, thus legalizing slavery in all but name. In 1542, after stinging criticism from a colonial priest, Bartolomé de las Casas, the Spanish monarch formulated a new code of law to reform the system, forbidding the conquerors from enslaving native peoples while still allowing them to collect money and goods from tributary villages. In response to the restrictions and to the declining indigenous populations, the encomenderos, familiar with slavery in Spain, began to import kidnapped Africans in order to increase the labor force under their direct control. They employed native peoples and Africans primarily in gold and silver mines, on sugar plantations, and on huge horse, cattle, and sheep ranches. African slavery was far more common on the larger Caribbean islands than on the mainland. Many demoralized residents of Mesoamerica accepted the Christian religion brought to New Spain by Franciscan and Dominican friars, men who had joined religious orders bound by vows of poverty and celibacy. The friars devoted their energies to persuading indigenous peoples to move into towns and to build Roman Catholic churches. Spaniards leveled existing cities, constructing cathedrals and monasteries on sites occupied by Aztec, Incan, and Mayan temples. In such towns, native peoples were exposed to European customs and religious rituals designed to assimilate Catholic and pagan beliefs. Friars deliberately juxtaposed the cult of the Virgin Mary with that of the corn goddess, and native peoples adeptly melded aspects of their traditional worldview with Christianity, in a process anthropologists call syncretism. Thousands of indigenous men and women residing in Spanish territory embraced Catholicism, at least partly because it was the religion of their new rulers and they were accustomed to obedience. Gold, silver, and Spain's decline. The New World's rich deposits of gold and silver, initially a boon, ultimately brought about the decline of Spain as a major power. China, a huge country with silver coinage, insatiably demanded Spanish silver, gobbling up an estimated half of the total output of New World mines, while paying twice the current price in Europe. In the 1570s, the Spanish began to dispatch silver-laden galleons annually from Acapulco, on Mexico's west coast, across the Pacific Ocean to trade at their new settlements at Manila in the Philippines. This gave Spaniards easy access to luxury Chinese goods such as silk and Asian spices. But the influx of wealth led to rapid inflation, which caused Spanish products to be overpriced in international markets and imported goods to become cheaper in Spain. The once profitable Spanish textile industry collapsed. The seemingly endless income from American colonies also emboldened Spanish monarchs to spend lavishly on wars against the Dutch and the English. Several times in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the monarchs repudiated the state debt, wreaking havoc on the nation's finances. When the South American gold and silver mines started to give out in the mid-17th century, Spain's economy crumbled and the nation lost much of its international importance.